The museum curator instructs some men to move an ancient artifact called an ammonite stone, which contains bones. At the same time, a maid was cleaning the floor. Elsewhere, a woman named Molly calls out to her daughter Mary, who is coughing violently in the middle of the night. Later, Molly asks Mary to collect some strange stones from the beach to sell in their shop. Mary finds an ammonite stone, but accidentally breaks it into smaller pieces while sliding down a hill. Upon returning home, Mary began researching ammonite. Soon after, a man named Roderick Murchison and his wife Charlotte, who were traveling around the world researching archaeology, arrived to see Mary's work. Roderick mentions hearing about Mary's work at the Geographical Society of London, but Mary seems unimpressed. Roderick excitedly asked if he could watch her work ashore and buy ammonite for her for a rather large sum. Although hesitant, Mary reluctantly agreed. Later, Roderick and Charlotte dine at a restaurant where Roderick requests a quieter room, ignoring Charlotte's preference to be in the main dining area. Roderick dominated the conversation while Charlotte remained silent. That night, Charlotte tried to get closer to her husband, but he pushed her away, saying it was not the right time to have another child, and went to bed. The next morning, Roderick met Mary at the beach. He finds some stones, but Mary informs him that most are useless except for one called an acropolite, a fossilized piece of hard dung. Roderick returns home to show Charlotte his findings but finds her depressed in bed. He insists she accompany him outside. During their outing, Roderick expresses frustration with Charlotte's continuous melancholy, stating she isn't well enough to travel with him because she is still recovering from an illness. He longs for his vibrant and clever wife to return. At Mary's shop, Roderick tells her that his wife is unwell and he has arranged for her to stay in the city. He asks Mary to take care of Charlotte and promises to pay her for a couple of weeks. Initially, Mary refuses, but Roderick pleads with her. The next morning, the maid at the hotel where the Murchisons are staying tries to wake Charlotte, but she refuses to get out of bed. When the maid insists, Charlotte throws something at her. Eventually, Charlotte goes to Mary's shop, and they both head to the shore. Mary offers Charlotte some food, but she refuses. While Mary works, Charlotte sits and gazes at the shoreline. Charlotte questions Mary's dedication to her work and protests that she didn't come to Lyme to work. Mary responds that she doesn't want Charlotte there and only allowed it because her husband paid her. This makes Charlotte leave. Later, Charlotte walks onto the beach and is almost knocked over by strong waves. Moments later, she stumbles into Mary's shop. They call for a doctor named Dr. Liebison, who diagnoses Charlotte with a fever from going into the water. The doctor asks Mary to take care of her, but Mary protests that she's not a nurse. Eventually, out of pity, Mary agrees. Later, Molly complains about Charlotte living with them and taking up Mary's bed space. Mary attends to Charlotte's fever, and when it gets late, she notices Charlotte talking in her sleep. The next morning, Mary goes to buy supplies from a woman named Elizabeth Philpott, who thinks she's getting medicine for her mother's poor health. Elizabeth is happy to see Mary and tries to invite her inside, but Mary refuses. Elizabeth also tries to tell her to keep the money, but Mary insists on leaving it. Back at home, Mary applies the medicine on Charlotte while she's still resting. When she's finished, Mary tries to draw a picture of Charlotte, but she suddenly wakes up. Dr. Liebison arrives and praises Mary's efforts for Charlotte's quick recovery. He advises Charlotte not to engage in anything too exciting or strenuous. Later that night, Charlotte spends some time playing the piano. The next morning, she and Mary head to the beach, where Mary sneaks quick glances at Charlotte as they sit in silence. When they return home, Mary continues to watch Charlotte closely. Later, Charlotte goes out to fetch coal for cooking, but falls and comes back inside, crying hysterically. That night, Charlotte asks Mary about her children, and Mary reveals she never had any. She explains that most of her mother's children died, and now she focuses on her work. That night, Mary opts to sleep in a chair, but Charlotte invites her to share the bed. The next morning, Molly scolds Charlotte for cleaning her belongings. Dr. Liebison invites Mary to a musical event, but Mary insists she'll only attend if Charlotte comes along. Mary helps Charlotte get dressed, and Charlotte returns the favor. They exchange awkward smiles before leaving. That night, at the event, Charlotte and Mary hold hands outside the door. Inside, Dr. Liebson introduces them to the guests, but Mary asks for directions to the restroom and instead goes to the roof to smoke. As the musical begins, Mary becomes jealous seeing Charlotte sitting with Elizabeth Philpott and laughing with other women. Mary's jealousy and anger build until she decides to leave. Realizing Charlotte didn't notice her departure, Mary goes home. Charlotte later finds Mary intensely writing and asks why she left. Charlotte takes the paper from Mary's hands and reads a poem about feeling alone. Charlotte tells Mary she was the most interesting and beautiful person at the event. When Charlotte tries to touch her, Mary pulls away. At the beach, Charlotte spots a valuable rock and starts digging. Mary warns it's too big and a waste of time, but eventually helps her move it. That night, they examine the bones in the rock. Mary recounts finding a precious rock at 11, but having to sell it to the British Museum to support her family. That night, Charlotte kisses Mary on the cheek to say goodnight, which quickly turns into passionate kissing, and they make love. The next day, Molly's cough worsens, and she coughs up blood. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Mary have lunch by the beach, remove their outerwear, and kiss and play around. That night, passionate sounds come from their room as they make love. The following morning, they wake up together in bed. Later, a man arrives to buy the ammonite that Mary and Charlotte discovered. When he offers a low price, Charlotte defends Mary's meticulous process of unearthing scientific marvels. Eventually, the man pays the price after hearing her speech. Sometime later, Molly gives Charlotte a letter that makes her angry, and she leaves abruptly. That night, Mary joins Charlotte in bed, and they passionately kiss again. The next morning, Charlotte packs her belongings and prepares to leave for London. Outside, Charlotte gazes at Mary as she boards the coach sent by her husband. They lock eyes as the coach drives away. As Mary walks back home, she moves slowly, reflecting on their parting. At home, Molly tries to talk to Mary, but she says she's going to bed. Later, Mary notices Molly attempting to sell the mirror that Charlotte gave her and takes it back. Eventually, Molly collapses, and Mary takes her to bed to rest. Soon, Dr. Lieberson comes to check on her. Sometime later, Elizabeth visits Mary's shop to offer her sympathy after Molly's loss. Elizabeth asks if Mary has contacted Charlotte, but Mary doesn't respond. Elizabeth admits she knows she hurt Mary and apologizes, explaining she wasn't sure she could meet Mary's expectations, but tried not to be her enemy. Mary says she tried to stay in touch, but Charlotte claims Mary grew distant and eventually stopped reaching out. Over time, the shop becomes abandoned and neglected. One day, Mary hears a knock on the door and receives a letter from Charlotte. She takes a deep breath, savoring the scent of her lover, and reads the letter. The next day, Mary heads to the port to board a ship to London. Upon arrival, she navigates through the crowd and uses the address from the letter to find Charlotte's house. The maid, Anna, mistakes her for a traitor, but lets her in when Mary says she's Charlotte's guest. Alone in a room, Mary opens a wardrobe and sees the ammonite that Roderick had bought from her. Soon after, Charlotte rushes down the stairs, embraces Mary, and kisses her in front of Anna. Mary reminds Charlotte of Anna's presence, but Charlotte dismisses it, saying she's just the maid. Charlotte tells Mary she has a surprise planned, but she can't wait. She takes Mary to an upstairs room prepared for them to live in together. Charlotte shows Mary the room, while Mary protests that she already has a home. Mary seems unsettled, and Charlotte asks her to speak up. Mary says she feels misled, since Charlotte only mentioned a visit. Charlotte confesses that she wanted to see Mary's reaction. Mary points out that Charlotte isn't considering her own life and work, just trying to fit Mary into hers. Charlotte pleads with Mary, expressing her desire not to return to her life before meeting her and assuring Mary she can continue her scientific work there. Mary tells Charlotte that she doesn't understand her, and when Charlotte tries to kiss her, Mary explains that Charlotte's proposition makes her feel trapped like a fancy bird in a cage. Mary decides to find accommodation alone in a hotel. Later, as Mary contemplates Charlotte, she heads to the British National Museum. She searches for the ammonite she discovered as a child and finds it displayed in the center of the museum. As she gazes at it, she notices Charlotte staring at her near the ammonite display. And those are also the final details of the movie. How do you feel? Please leave your comments below to let us know. That's it for today. See you in the next video. Don't forget to give me a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.